G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day and happy Friday. I hope that your weekend is more enjoyable than I guess your work week may have been. A bad weekend is better than a good week at work. Now legends, I'm feeling a lot better today after my hiccup with my treatment, but I see my psychologist for my first appointment this afternoon, as well as he practices a bit of hypnotherapy to try and get me through this chemo as smoothly as we can. So if tomorrow I come and then I'm sprouting all sorts of nonsense propaganda, you know that the hypnotherapist has been compromised. Anyway, legends, of course, as always, there's a lot to look at today. We're going to look at the maps. We're going to compare maps, and I have geolocations to show you map changes that the maps may or may not be showing. I need to talk about then Ukraine's warning of Russia increasing troops a further 150,000 and saying that they can do this, as well as we need to look at what Zelensky has laid out as far as his red lines. And then we need to look at where Russia is sitting, where Ukraine is sitting, where the US is trying to sit in the middle, and these are just so far away. What hopes is there? But the main meat in this video is going to be from a general in the US Europe Command and what he has said about Russia's real battlefield position and its strategic position outwardly too, not just in Ukraine, because very recently you have known what I've said is Russia has taken large tactical losses in this war and economic losses too, but their strategic assets have really been untouched. When we're talking subs, Tu-160s, nuclear weapons, early warning and over-the-horizon systems, they have been basically, if not at all, untouched. So we have to go over that too. And then we need to look at where then the relationship between Russia and China is sitting and how I think the US overestimate this a little bit. And there should be a bit of caution when proceeding here. So this is where we will start. So this is General Christopher Cavoli. He's United States Army, United States European Command, known as US-EU Com. If you see that then shortening of it. Now, this is the complete statement of himself on April the 3rd, 25 to then the US Senate. If you want to read through the whole thing, I believe it's 16 or 17 pages. It is on the Telegram, but I've pulled out parts that I believe are relevant for today's video. There was also a question and answers section to this, and we'll go over some that are relevant at the end of this. So let's begin. The Euro-Atlantic security environment. The US today confronts the most challenging threats in the European theatre since the end of the Cold War. Russia's brutal war in Ukraine just entered its fourth year, and Russia remains willing to use military force to accomplish its geopolitical objectives. These include ambitions to expand its territorial control, broaden its influence regionally and globally, and diminish US leadership and influence. Russia is actively conducting a destabilization campaign within Europe intended to create strategic dilemmas for the United States. Now, this destabilization campaign in Europe, you'll hear a lot about this. Now, I am not doubting that Russia, through intelligence operations and through war, as well as China through the same, is conducting a level of destabilization in Europe. Now, you'll know from my opinion on this, what we have seen is Rand's 2019 article then about, what's it called? I'm trying to think of what exactly it was called. It's called Stretching Russia or Thinning Russia or something. I'll put it up here. They spoke of that if Russia was to move into Ukraine, if there are actions and they then deem that they have to move in, this is one of the outcomes, that it may undermine certain coalitions and treaties and agreements in Europe. Now, the destabilization that we see in Europe, I think it is the stick in the spokes of fucking Putin. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a degree of that, but I believe the most destabilization that we see in Europe is internally then created. It's created in politics. It's created in policy, but I think we blame externally a lot, and we'll see how the future comes when you just blame externally and don't then look inwardly. You end up with what the US has right now. Continue. Furthermore, Russia's ongoing effort to develop a massive military larger than its pre-war force, combined with its propensity to absorb military, political, and economic costs to achieve its strategic goals. never underestimate what a country that believes a war is existential will absorb to achieve its goals and survival. We've seen what Ukraine has absorbed to do this, and Russia, when the war turned existential, will do the same. This indicates that Russia poses an enduring threat to the US, our NATO allies, and global security. This threat is intensified by Russia's strengthened relationships with the Chinese Communist Party and North Korea, and of course, Iran. Now, Russian Reconstitution. This is a part that is vastly different from a lot, we'll tell you. Despite extensive battlefield losses in Ukraine, the Russian military is reconstituting and growing at a faster rate than most analysts had anticipated. In fact, the Russian army, which has borne the brunt of combat, is today larger than it was at the beginning of the war. And I'll add, much more experienced. Despite suffering an estimated almost 800,000 casualties, again, that should have an asterisk there. We don't know. That is relying on figures given from then the other warring party. I don't trust that figure, and I don't trust the figure if Russia then release their own figure about then Ukraine's casualties also. Moscow has ordered the military to increase its strength to 1.5 million active service members and is recruiting approximately 30,000 troops per month. Russian forces on the front lines of Ukraine are now at over 600,000, the highest level over the course of the war and almost double the size of the initial invasion force. This tells us how Russia's then war plans have changed from an occupation to an attritional then almost conquering of land through a different means, not just rolling over. Russia is not just reconstituting service members, but is also replacing combat vehicles and munitions at an unprecedented pace. Russian ground forces in Ukraine have lost an estimated 3,000 tanks, 9,000 armoured vehicles, and 13,000 artillery systems, and over 400 defence systems in the past year, but is on pace to replace them all. And these are being replaced with more modern equipment. This is not what the media or officials have been telling us for years. Now, Russia has expanded its industrial production, opened new manufacturing facilities, and converted commercial production lines for military purposes. As a result, the Russian defence industrial base is expected to roll out 1,500 tanks, 3,000 armoured vehicles, and 200 Iskander ballistic and cruise missiles this year. Comparatively, the US only produces 135 tanks per year and no longer produces new Bradley IFVs. Now, what we see is from Soviet to Russia, they do put then quantity over quality. And I think this war is showing that a protracted war like this, it is the correct way of thinking because Ukraine has plenty of quality, but what they are struggling on is quantity. Additionally, we anticipate Russia to produce 250,000 artillery shells per month, which puts it on track to build a stockpile 3 times greater than the US and Europe combined. It's not a gas station with nuclear weapons. The industry here for military is absolutely massive, and there are plenty of countries that the US do not see as friendly who will not do military trade with them that will want to get their hands on this when there is then extra following this, and the Russian military-industrial complex will be able to buffer a lot of those losses as well, economic losses, I mean. Not all Russia's military capability has been degraded by war. This is what I've been saying. Russia has suffered little to no strategic losses. Early warning, over-the-horizon radars, submarines, nuclear weapons, Tu-160s. The Black Sea Fleet is not the only fleet that Russia has. It's actually its least as far as globally than strategic fleet. Okay? Russia continues to hold the largest nuclear weapons stockpile with an estimated 2,500 to 3,500 high and low yield warheads tailored for different use on the battlefield or long range. Kremlin updated its nuclear policy and has lowered the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. This is a saber-rattling technique. Russia also maintains a robust chemical and biological weapons program. They also point at the use here of riot control chlorpicrin. Now, he says here, chemical weapon chlorpicrin and riot control, no, that's the same thing. It's the K-51 grenade. Many, many examples of both Ukraine and Russia using that, and they are both using it illegally as under the CWC, the Chemical Warfare Conventions here. It is illegal, and it is specifically then pulled out as then illegal also. Anyway, within its air and maritime capabilities, Russia has sustained only minor losses in Ukraine. The Russian Aerospace Force currently retains over 1,100 combat-capable aircraft that include Su-57 stealth fighters, Tu-95 and Tu-160 long-range strategic bombers. And we've seen very little losses realistically of this. And we've been following UAC, United Aircraft Company, that build a lot of these jets, and what we have been showing you, even with photographic proof, we're not taking their numbers, photographic evidence, they are above replacement at the moment. And just like those vehicles, replacing older equipment with newer equipment. Okay. These are strategic bombers. Aside from some losses in the BSF, the Black Sea Fleet, the Russian Navy remains intact. Over 60 submarines and 40 surface vessels capable of launching nuclear-tipped, Kaliber cruise missiles. So this is what the US is worried about. The US is worried about those strategic elements, and that has realistically not been degraded much at all. And some would suggest it's actually improved because lessons learnt in this around things like Kaliber cruise missiles, air defense, ATACMS, Storm Shadows, a lot of learning around this has actually been has actually then been able to improve some of those strategic systems as well. Russian commanders still emphasize quantity and mass over skill and operational acumen. However, the poorly resourced and disorganized Russian forces we saw during the initial invasion have improved significantly and under the pressures of war. Never underestimate how much improvements and how many lessons then belligerents can learn. You cannot remain in limbo and on the back foot and assume that they're not going to improve. As people say, Russia has always been historically slow to stand up. Russian formations are gaining combat experience. The military has demonstrated its ability to learn from the battlefield, disseminate new concepts across organizations, and counter Ukrainian tactical and technical advantages. It has implemented rapid cycles of adaptation and is developing new capabilities to accelerate force modernization. The perfect example of this is the fiber optic controlled drone, where it went from a pretty level battlefield to then Russia majorly in front with that system. In November 24, the Russian military conducted its first strike on a Ukrainian military facility with the new Otoshnik intermediate range ballistic missile. So he says here that it was a military facility. Officials have stated this missile can be equipped with a nuclear warhead. We've seen the Russian forces employ new domestically produced electronic countermeasures against Ukrainian jamming technology to improve strike efficiency. This is what I'm hearing behind the scenes. The most amount of concern over is Russia's electronic warfare and the jamming and successful jamming of things like GPS. Russian ground forces are integrating reconnaissance and one-way attack drones into their offensives on the battlefield, so combined warfare. Russia is also expanding its undersea capabilities through the addition of a new nuclear-class submarine, and as well as another ballistic missile submarine as well, and other undersea reconnaissance capabilities in both the European and Indo-Pacific theatres. These new capabilities show the Russian military is intent on gaining tactical and operational advantage for the future battlefield, but also can economically still look at assets that have no bearing on this war. These submarines will have zero bearing on this war, and still they are incredibly expensive, still being able to allocate resources towards that. That tells us a lot about then the economy. To support Russia's growing military apparatus, the Kremlin has established economic policies to restructure its financial institutions and defense industry. In September 24, Russia announced a 25% increase in defense spending, which represents 6.3% of its GDP. Russia's defense budget will account for 40% of all government expenditures, its highest level since the Cold War. But that is still significantly lower than it actually was in the Cold War. If you want to see if Russia can sustain this and potentially even grow it and what long-term effects this will have, there's a podcast below with a Doctor of Economics specifically on this. As a direct result of its defence spending, Russian investments in its industrial base have reduced national unemployment to 2.4%. The Russian economy is on a war footing and will remain so for the foreseeable future. So employment is way down, and with more people employed, more money than ever being thrown at defence companies and even thrown for soldiers to go to the front line, then of course you will see a growth in inflation rates. Russia's strategic partnerships. Further complicating the global security environment and threatening the US are Russia's deepening strategic partnerships with our adversaries. Russia increasing collusion with the CCP, North Korea and Iran. The group, as people will put as the axis of upheaval, shares Russian vision of a multipolar world and is providing an economic lifeline to Moscow. Now, China does not share, they do not share the view of a multipolar world, nor do they share the view of a unipolar world. China has not shared that over its 4,000-year history. China has seen itself as the center of the world and everything else as basically an exception to that. They may then lean into when they need strategically with Putin's vision, but they do not see themselves as Russia and them and the US being equal as multipole. No, they see themselves as becoming the unipolar power. That is like China long-term strategic doctrine and Outlook 101. To avoid Western sanctions, the CCP and Russia are increasing the use of national currencies to conduct trade outside of SWIFT, away from the USD, of course, within BRICS, using non-traditional finance options for business transactions and employing financial techniques that bypass secondary sanctions. Half of Russia's energy exports currently go to China, and this is a lot why I think we see Trump wanting to end this war to try and stop China getting a really good deal on those assets that Russia can provide. Just as concerning as stronger economic ties is the increasing military cooperation between these nations. Russia's introduction, he claims here, of the 12,000 North Korean troops into Kursk constitute an egregious escalation of the conflict. It also has global ramifications, creating the opportunity for North Korean soldiers to gain experience from modern combat and take their lessons back to the Indo-Pacific. The DPRK is providing millions of artillery shells, missiles and weapon systems to fuel Russian operations in Ukraine. Now, you know what I think about the numbers here realistically of North Korean troops and the claims v. the evidence. But we do see that there's going to be other countries wanting to gain experience from this. North Korea, not that worried. It's more China. What I'd be more interested in is what commanders has China sent across to sit in Moscow and overview operations and see how things are going, and what troops is Russia sending to China to then train their forces on the ground. We do this all the time with, a special forces unit coming into an infantry unit somewhere in the world to then train. It's exactly what we're trying to do with the Afghan National Army to bring them to a standard. I would almost guarantee that China has interest in bringing in some of these combat veterans from Russia to teach them their ways. They claim here that there's going to be a transfer of missile technology to Pyongyang. That would be the obvious payment, I guess, for this, would be technology for then hard assets. Talk about then Iran here, and then the licensing of the Shahed to Garan drones. What recently have had a large increase in effectiveness on the front line from the videos that I'm seeing. Now, Russia's no limits partnership with China is creating military opportunities for our adversaries to hold the US interests at risk. In the past year, Russia and China conducted 2 combined bomber patrols from Russia, one over the Bering Sea and the other over the Sea of Japan. These patrols marked the first time Chinese bombers departed from the same airbase with Russian bombers, so conducting training together. Their coast guards have also conducted their first combined patrol in the North Pacific. As the Arctic ice cap recedes, both China and Russia are looking to exploit the new navigable waterways. We've spoken about this with the North Sea route and China building up to become an Arctic power, and Russia with its then nuclear icebreaker fleet. The CCP, aka China, also seeks to create opportunities in Europe to exert its global influence and fracture the West. For instance, China's strategic investments with individual European countries cause potential strain within the NATO alliance. Beijing is pushing to expand telecommunication services, green energy companies, and electric vehicle industries within Europe. These investments may create economic growth, but they pose security risks and offer openings for China and Russia to degrade US interests and sow disunity among allies. Now, electric vehicles, this is a perfect one to go over in China's strategic defense and reactionary, retaliatory operations, both in business and military. Now, firstly, I believe that we overstate China's relationship with Russia. It's not long-term, and it is only there as long as it benefits them. There's not this long-standing trust, friendship, and overall ideology sitting there either. I think we do overstate that. As long as it's good for Xi, he will sit there, but I believe he could cut that off quickly. I've said I believe that Xi could be playing Putin as well. Now, we also interpret anything that China does as hostile. China pursues its national interests, and we take that as hostile even if it is legitimate business economic growth. It can have the secondary effect of strategic, maybe hostility, but was that the primary then objective of that? We just interpret it as hostile. We're going to speak on this more and in my full breakdown of China. But the best example that I've seen by the TikTok media guy, Dylan Page, was his going back over BYD. BYD is a massive Chinese electric car company. Of course, this creates a massive competition. Well, it's actually overtaken Tesla, but it creates huge competition for then American electric car company Tesla, who was leading the world for many years. Now, the Biden administration, they've come out and basically said that this is like a strategic hostile actions because BYD receives CCP funding while Tesla is a private company. Now, what you can see here is, well, you're making that a strategic thing. It may not be then a hostile military action in the first place. Do you get what I'm meaning? That business here, the CCP, if they want to fund then a electric car company and then create that, that still is legitimate economic growth and interest. It may have a secondary effect of weakening some of these, but competition is competition, and the CCP want to fund that. Well, your competition is going to have to keep up. We're going to go over that sort of strategic defense more. The deepening economic and military partnerships between Russia and China, the DPRK and Iran, the axis of upheaval, indicative of a more intricate and global threat. These close partnerships underscore the US is increasingly likely to face multiple threats simultaneously. Moreover, our adversaries are learning from the war in Ukraine and accelerating the exchange of military technologies. Now, speaking more on China, this is one of the last slides of my conclusion of the US assessment on major state actors of China. Now, it is highly complex. You need to look at that it is a US assessment. And of course, they need to display how actions pose a threat, even if the action within itself is not malign. And we go over how we are adding our view of what is hostile, even if it may not be. And this last paragraph here is what I want to share with you. This assessment largely frames China's actions as purely aggressive, overlooking the reality that many of Beijing's strategies, such as military modernization, technological self-reliance, and influence operations, are primarily defensive, aimed at deterring perceived threats, particularly from US power. Failing to recognize this defensive logic risks misunderstanding China's true motivations, leading to flawed strategic response and unnecessary escalation. The best one of this is how people view China's movement into creating much smaller nanometer chips is strategic hostile actions, when it was sanctioned back in the day that China couldn't then import and use these small chips, so they had to move their industry to then create these strategic defense. And we cannot overlook this. Of course, there are malign hostile actions, but you need to understand how China operate and how they have operated for thousands of years. But let's continue more on this. Of course, this US, EU, United States, European Command deters Russian aggression against NATO. Credible deterrence requires the presence of combat-capable forces and a sufficient force presence to convince Russia that any military action harmful to the interests of the US will be met with force. US-EU Com must prepare the forces assigned and allocated to us to fight and win. And here he goes over key elements such as naval, F-35, AI, and troops in Europe also. Now, the conclusion here. We maintain the capability and capacity to defend the homeland forward and project US power globally. and deter Russian aggression against NATO in support of US interests. Now, this is, I think, an important point when we see the current administration in the White House. We deter Russian aggression in support of US interest, and this is what we do see a large divergence on at the moment, is US interests and Europe seeing eye to eye, and I think we'll see a lot of changes here. Moscow's ongoing war in Ukraine, destabilisation campaign against the West, societal mobilisation for war, and growing strategic partnerships with our adversaries all indicate that Russia will continue to threaten US security and economic interests well into the future. So well into the future, Russia will still be a threat, so it's not going to collapse imminently like we've been hearing now for the best part of 4 years. That will do all required of the leadership and continued investment in advanced capabilities and a sustainable transition to an allied-led defence in Europe. So this transition to more of a Europe-led NATO in Europe rather than American-led. But what we say is NATO for European states is a defensive alliance. NATO for America is not that. It is a strategic alliance to then pursue its power globally and have an arm reaching into Europe and Asia rather than being very much isolated there, because there is a threat of the other Western states coming under control of another power. So let's look further at the Q&A, and this is what was said about Russian personnel. Now, what I'm going to do is play some of these at 1.5 times speed to belt feed through this a little bit.
How effective have the long-range missiles that we've allowed Ukrainians to shoot into Russia? How effective has that been?
Very.
In all areas?
Yeah, they've been extremely effective, sir. I could go into this in private session, but the United States makes some very good weaponry, and it's the ones we've donated have been very, very effective. In closed session, I'd be happy to talk to you about a few of the things they've done with it.
So talking about that, the US long-range weaponry that Ukraine has had has been incredibly effective. Now, I'm not doubting that each individual may have been effective, but we saw the amount that Ukraine received off the US. It was never enough to really make strategic changes on the battlefield. Now, I have actually cut out one of my videos here. I must have downloaded the wrong one, but we need to talk about then Russian personnel, and I'll put that video in here. Apologies about that.
So if we divide Russia's rebuilding capability into two big blocks, personnel and equipment, I believe the personnel they'll be able to build as quickly as they want to. They continue to maintain a conscription. You saw that just last week, the Russian government announced its annual conscription drive. It increased by 10,000 over last year, 160,000 this year. With those numbers, they will be able to constitute the force size that they choose fairly quickly. Be a little tougher, take them a little bit more time to organize it into the sort of organizations that they have said they want to build after the war. They want to have an army of about 1.5 million, they've announced. They want to put a lot of it on the border of NATO and northeastern Europe. It'll take them a little bit of time to do that, but we're talking a couple of years. Equipment, that depends on how much more they lose inside Ukraine, sir. They've lost a vast amount of equipment inside Ukraine. They started the war with someplace near 13,000 tanks on active and in storage, and they're starting to approach near the end of that, near the end of the useful tanks in storage. So depending on how much more they lose, that will really determine how quickly they can regenerate. They have expanded their capability to produce some things, artillery shells, cruise missiles, tremendously, and they're producing some things such as one-way attack drones in prodigious numbers that they weren't even producing at all before the war.
And I would characterize that capability as offensive. In other words, they're not defending against a possible invasion from Ukraine. They are preparing for continuing offensive actions against Ukraine and possibly NATO allies if they are successful in Ukraine.
And I would add to that, Senator, that this is not just in the ground domain. They have long-range aviation that practices daily, moving out and doing strikes across North America. They have their strategic ballistic missile fleet, their road mobiles that are constantly out there, and they have their submarine fleet that's constantly out there. So it's not just in those domains. And then there is, of course, the cyber domain, in which, you know, they're very active. We can talk about in closed session, sir.
So we get a good idea there of how things really probably are looking. Remember, anything from then officials, especially high-ranking officials, it has its own element of information too, and some of that may be changed around to fit the idea that Trump wants to get out of this war. So, Russia's still powerful, they're still going to continue. We need to pull out of this and have a negotiating position. This can play into that idea as well. But I believe it is very realistic of what we are seeing on the battlefield that goes against, we heard in 22, that they're out of missiles, they're out of tanks, they're out of men, and that hasn't happened. And we have seen the ability for new weapon systems and old weapon systems refurbished to enter the battlefield, and massive development also. Now, before we go over the increase of men, let's have a look at the maps. So, of course, we have Ukraine in the centre of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. The red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 2014, and the red check is ground that Russia has made over the past 24 hours. So where we're first going to come is where Ukraine has, of course, crossed into Kursk and are currently being pushed back. So this map, it does look slightly different from yesterday. So we'll see just around this sector here to the west of Suja. If we go back to yesterday, we have this. So it is at 69 square kilometres. And then today we see this. We're down to 63 kilometres. So 6 kilometre square change there by at least deep state map. But I want to have a little bit of a further look in here because there is some geolocations that show different. Remember, geolocation here over a week ago. Geolocation today, I'll show you this here, is sitting just here in Guevo as well. So it's just above where this road turns out. It's just about in here. We see then this footage from a Russian soldier and a lot of fighting and heavily destroyed areas in these sectors. But we get an idea of where those forces may be sitting. Well, we get an idea of where then they are sitting. So let's cancel that. Let's move our way just to the northeast of here. Now, there is a lot of talk that there's been further movement towards Grafolka in then the Belgrade region. Let's see if there's any changes on this map. No, there is not. So wait out on that one. Let's move our way into then the northeast of Richnia. Now, what we see is just here, just south of Petrivka. This is where Syriac said there was changes over the past few days. And we see today that this green zone has then become grey zone. So definite movement on that axis. Control ground, we don't know. That's not enough to say that, but definite changes. Right, let's continue moving our way down the map, and we come to Toretsk, one of the most liquid areas on the front line. Very hard to know exactly what is going on in here, but Surek says the Russian army recaptured completely the district of Zabalka, which sits just down in here. The Ukrainian army began the withdrawal from the vicinity of the stadium, which sits right in here. Okay, let's continue our way down and we'll start to see some red check on this map. Kudakov, now Rosliv front. We can see Andreevkia, this area coming under control. In my opinion, this isn't a new update at all, but it does show that there is definite movement here. And we do see from then this map in here, sorry, I was named a bit off, that we do see there was definitely some movement in here, probably substantially more than we are seeing. So if we get an idea of where these sectors are, this dot is Andreevkia, this is Constantinople, so we can see where then this dot, this is Constantinople in here. This is Rosliv here. So it's saying the front line's coming right up this sector along to whereabouts my cursor is at the moment. That is the claim in this sector. What would be a further 3.3 kilometre movement according to Syriac maps here. We still see this movement in Rosliv and Constantinople coming under control. As well, did we see any movement down in the southern area? Yes, almost then missed it. We have then Velika Novosilka front line, Ferivkia, and we see further movements up around Veseli according to the Syriac maps. So let's move our way further then west and we'll come to the Lobkove Stepove front. I showed you yesterday geolocation right here of a Russian flag. So I would say that that is red at this point in time when flags are going up. And the grey zone has moved there, but some red check around this front line. Let's look at the Syriac maps, and we see where Lobkove is, this movement further out of Lobkove, as well as to the western side above the Zerabanki in here. So this sector, he's saying, coming all under control. Given the geolocation we saw, probably that is the situation that is occurring in there. So let's go over this article from Ukrainian media that Russia is preparing for an offensive in several directions and plans to increase its forces by 150,000 this year. Now, this has been said from the deputy head of the president's office, Pavlo Palis, a correspondent for Sispilny Reports. Now, what apparently he said was, their formation is ongoing. The Russians currently have no problems with attracting personnel. However, it is necessary to understand that all these formations cannot be brought into battle at the same time, of course, rotations. Therefore, it is expected that in the near future, they'll try to exert maximum pressure in those directions where it is possible. So he's saying there is no problems attracting personnel. Now, according to him, the build-up of pressure on the front is taking place against the backdrop of consultations on ceasefire, in which the Russians have little interest. Given the starting point of that, I can see why they have little interest there. Regarding the ground direction, it is obvious that they continue to gradually advance, trying to push through individual sectors at the front, he says. But if they can afford it, they'll continue to stall for a long time. In some areas of the front, the enemy has some successes, but we are also counterattacking and are also achieving results. I'm not sure where. Zelensky said in an interview with Figaro that the Kremlin leader is trying to buy time and is preparing for a spring offensive. If this offensive is real, what we'll see is Zelensky try and push even harder for a ceasefire, because if Russia is able to launch this size offensive at the moment along a broad front, it would end up in a much worse position for Ukraine at the negotiating table down the line. Now, this is from a slide earlier this week that I showed you. And I did say that this is speculation, but what we are seeing is a huge shift in then narratives, rhetoric from the battlefield. Zelensky's overall tone towards ceasefire has changed 180 degrees from no way, no ceasefire, never, to we need a ceasefire, Russia's denying it, blah, blah, blah. We've seen Putin is delaying ceasefire agreements and saying that we can finish them off. Ukrainian commanders, they have publicly voiced concern, suggesting that Russia is preparing an offensive. Putin saying finish them off. And we're seeing that everyone's saying Putin is now the one prolonging negotiations, delaying ceasefire. And what I'm saying in this is, if this is true, this is what we're seeing, that if there is about to be a large offensive and Ukraine is wanting a ceasefire more and more, that may tell us about the real battlefield situation because of that huge change in tone. That may be very critical. Now, this is some outtakes from some speeches that Zelensky has made over the past 24 hours. He has said that diplomatic means may be the only way to eventually return some Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine. He said that these are Ukrainian territories. This is one of the main red lines for us. In any case, it is a temporary occupation of territories. So saying Ukraine will never recognise former Ukrainian territories that Russia is now in control of. They'll never recognise it's a red line. But if it is possible to find a compromise so that the return of these territories occurs over time through diplomatic means, I think that probably, as far as some territories are concerned, will be the only way. So coming to the conclusion that militarily these are not going to be returned, but it will be diplomatic. The cost that Russia has taken to take those, I don't see how that is going to take place. Zelensky, he's also commented that Ukraine will not reduce the size of its military and plans to instead increase it. Of course, Russia wants them to decrease that size in any negotiation. Now, he also said that Russia must pay reparations and we don't want the world to forgive them. And as you can see from the negotiation requirements from Ukraine and Russia, all of this is a non-starter at this point in time. My question is, how long will the US actually have the patience for this before withdrawing support or looking into a leader in Ukraine that will negotiate in realpolitik, as they know Russia can just stall, and as their assessment says, can continue this for a long time? Will they look into withdrawing support and saying it's on Europe, or will they look into you need an election and a leader that is more likely to take into account what is actually happening at the moment, mixed in with, I think, the further sanctions and secondary sanctions that the US can put on Russia will be much more slow to affect them than it would if they pull out support from Ukraine. So this is why I think Putin is fairly safe in a way of delaying this. Now, if you don't know the term realpolitik, this is a German realistic, practical, or actual approach in politics. This is the approach of conducting diplomatic or political policies based primarily on consideration of given circumstances and factors, rather than strictly following ideological, moral, or ethical premises. And what I'll say is America, they're leaning into this, and a lot of Europe is not at the moment, given the actual situation. And we know that there is a Russian negotiator in Washington at the moment, that there was then sanctions lifted off him so he could get a visa so he could come. And then he said that we've made 3 steps forward, and also that significant progress has been made on a ceasefire agreement in Ukraine. When asked if his meetings had resulted in a step forward, he said, yes, definitely. I would say that today and yesterday we made 3 steps forward on a large number of issues. According to him, the issues have been piling up for 3 years. There was virtually no communication between Russia and the US. Therefore, the progress of dialogue, the process of resolution, will take some time, but it is definitely positive and constructive. He has also said, of course, the dialogue continues, and there will be many more important key meetings, including the participation of key leaders from the Russian side and key technical specialists, that the dialogue will continue. He's also said that US companies are ready to occupy the niches left by European companies that left the Russian Federation. And may that become more attractive now that tariffs are getting added everywhere from the US to try and backfill some industry. I don't know. Legends, you have a fantastic day, and I will speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.